They weren't just sandwiches. They were survival, spirit, and stolen heritage pressed between two pieces of forgotten bread. What was lost when we stopped passing down the meals that once held nations together? Fry bread tacos with bison were once a communal crown jewel. Golden, pillowy fry bread packed with seasoned bison meat, often shredded or pan-seared. This was not fast food. This was food that took time, skill, and sacred memory. You could smell the crisping dough from 100 feet away at community gatherings, powwows, or even just a family weekend. The bison brought not only nutrition but reverence, an animal that gave everything and once blanketed the plains. Back then, bison was hunted with care, shared without hesitation, and seasoned with more than salt. These tacos might have been topped with beans, chilies, or a scoop of sweet squash mash, wrapped in foil or corn husk for later. Today, fry bread survives mostly through carnival stands and powwow vendors, but its pairing with bison has quietly slipped away. Why? Some of it is cost. Some of it is loss. Some of it is the fact that bison is no longer something families can just have. It has been pushed to novelty status. And fry bread, once born of government rations and survival, has been pulled into an uneasy spotlight. But if you ever had one of these tacos as a child, you remember the warmth. You remember that feeling of being full, for once, in more ways than one. Smoked trout cornbread sandwiches were the northern traveler's treasure. Smoked flaked fish folded into thick slices of cornmeal bread packed tight for the road. It was not fancy, but it was powerful. Tribes along cold lakes and mountain rivers smoked their fish until it could last for weeks, then sandwiched it between pan-fried or stone-baked cornbread slabs. The result was portable, rich in protein, and layered with smoke and earth. A bite of this and you got the forest, the stream, and the campfire in one go. The sandwich was eaten on horseback, in canoes, or tucked in bark pouches during hunting treks. The trout, pink and oily, often mixed with herbs or wild onions. The cornbread was dense and hearty, able to hold its shape for days without crumbling. Today, these sandwiches are nearly extinct, replaced by crackers and canned spreads that barely hint at what used to be. The trout is still there, and so is the cornmeal, but the memory of pressing them together in survival and ceremony has faded. What was once instinctual is now sold separately at specialty food stores. Do we even know what we lost when the smoke stopped rising from those riverside camps? Acorn bread and wild berry meat sandwiches were forest sandwiches in the truest sense, built from the woods and eaten in silence under trees. The bread came first, made from acorn flour that had to be soaked, pounded, and leached of bitterness. It was a chore, a ritual, and a necessity. Then came the filling, thin slices of dried venison or rabbit, layered with crushed blackberries, choke cherries, or huckleberries, depending on the season. The sweetness cut the gaminess. The bread crumbled just slightly as you bit in. This was a sandwich that kept for days, that filled you up without making you heavy. It tasted like bark, rain, and sweetness after struggle. It traveled well. It honored the land. Native children once carried these into the woods like modern kids carry packed lunches. Now, acorn flour is a novelty ingredient. Dried game is bought in sealed plastic, and the pairing of both with wild berries no supermarket can replicate has been mostly lost. If someone handed you one today, would your mouth even recognize it as food or just memory? We stopped making these not because they were bad, but because we stopped doing the work they required. And maybe that is what hurts most. Three Sisters pocket flatbreads were the closest thing to soul food that the soil itself ever gave. Inside a warm flatbread pocket went a mash of squash, beans, and corn, the Three Sisters of traditional native agriculture. They were not just ingredients, they were family. Grown together, harvested together, and eaten together. The flatbread was made from maize flour or leftover mash from the harvest, cooked hot and fast on stone or clay. The inside could be creamy or chunky depending on the cook, and was often flavored with wild garlic or chili. Children would eat them running. Elders would eat them slowly. They were warm, golden, and grounding. But they are almost entirely gone now. replaced by mass-produced breads and flavorless substitutions. You can still find the Three Sisters on school posters or in museums, but not folded into a meal you can hold in your hand. We broke apart what was always meant to stay together, and in doing so, we lost not just nutrition, but balance. Who decided we did not need to eat this way anymore? And what else have we unlearned because of it? Elk jerky sliders on Cedar Buns were winter food with a scent you never forgot. Meaty, smoky, and soaked in the aroma of trees. This was not just lunch, this was ceremony. Elk jerky, cut thick and dried slow, was a prized food in the colder regions. When times were good, it got layered into small cedar-smoked buns made from flour mixed with bark ash or fir tips. Served at winter gatherings, these sliders were eaten cold or warm, sometimes dipped in broth or spiced oil. The cedar buns were not just flavor, they were preservative, story, and smoke all at once. The sandwich gave energy, preserved meat, and honored the animal. Today, jerky is processed and peppered with artificial sweeteners. The cedar has vanished, and so has the meaning. We made the meat last, but not the memory. What used to keep people alive through months of snow now lives in glass jars at gourmet stores. We call it rustic. We call it old-fashioned. But the people who made it were not trying to be cute. They were surviving. Can we even still taste the difference between survival and snack food? Maple venison biscuit sandwiches were the morning food of hunters, gatherers, and frost-covered fields. You could smell them from a distance. Grain-heavy biscuits cracked open with strips of venison glazed in maple syrup tucked inside like a gift. It was breakfast, yes, but also reward. The venison was lean and chewy, usually left over from stews or fire-cooked roasts. The maple syrup came from trees tapped by hand, slowly boiled down into a dark, sticky dream. When layered into biscuits made from wild or hand-ground grains, the result was a sweet, savory blend that filled the stomach and lifted the spirit. These sandwiches were often shared at sunup when the day was about to get long and hard. Today, you can find maple bacon on every diner menu, but maple venison? Almost never. The flavor has been replaced, commercialized, or forgotten entirely. But it once meant a good hunt, a warm hearth, a day that started with purpose. We traded it all in for drive-through versions that do not ask for anything from us. What do we lose when we stop earning our sweetness? Sunchoke and pine nut flatbread wraps were desert energy bars before energy bars existed. Sunchokes, those nutty, crunchy roots, were sliced thin, pan-roasted, and wrapped with toasted pine nuts inside maize flatbread. No sauce, no garnish, just sunlight turned into food. Southwest tribes used these for midday meals and travel snacks, giving bursts of energy without weighing the body down. Sunchokes, with their natural sweetness, paired perfectly with the buttery richness of pine nuts. The wrap was soft, earthy, and grounding. Nothing fancy, but everything thoughtful. You could walk all day with one of these in your satchel and still feel strong. Today, sunchokes are rediscovered only by chefs looking for obscure ingredients, while pine nuts are sold at luxury prices. The wrap? Gone. What was once survival food has become exotic. But there was nothing exotic about it when it kept you going through dry winds and endless miles. We did not call them superfoods. We just called them food. And that might be the biggest difference of all. Salmon belly sandwiches with wild greens were pure coastal power, fatty, rich fish layered with gathered greens and tucked into dough made from maize or even wrapped in kelp. The belly was the prized cut, oiled and luscious, smoked or seared just enough to flake apart. The greens were bitter or sharp, dandelion, nettle, or mustard leaves picked fresh from coastal soil. The bread varied, sometimes dense and baked, other times simply a blanket of dried seaweed. Either way, the effect was the same. Nourishment from land and sea, eaten slowly or taken for a cold journey ahead. Salmon belly is now tossed aside in favor of cleaner cuts. Wild greens are weeded out or sprayed over. And the knowledge of how they fit together? Nearly gone. These sandwiches were medicine in a way. They kept bones strong and hearts full. Now we barely know what to do with them. What happens when we forget how to eat the best parts? Wild rice cake sandwiches with duck were sticky, rich, and deeply satisfying. Meals built near lakes, cooked over fire, and eaten with reverence. The rice was hand-harvested by canoe, soaked and shaped into firm patties, then griddled until crisp on the outside and chewy inside. Duck meat, usually smoked or slow-roasted, went between them. No sauce needed. The fat from the duck seeped into the rice, making each bite earthy, oily, and full of depth. These were celebration foods and everyday lunches rolled into one. The sandwich was portable, delicious, and deeply tied to the rhythms of water and migration. Wild rice still exists, but much of it is cultivated and stripped of its ritual. Duck is a delicacy now, not a staple. Together, they were once food and identity. We have kept the ingredients, but not the reason. Can you taste the difference when you do not know why it mattered? Cactus fruit and cornmeal sliders were the roadside miracle of the Southwest. Bright, spiced cactus fruit mashed and served inside thick patties made from masa. They were tangy, sweet, and just a little spicy. No two batches were ever the same. The cactus fruit, also called prickly pear, was roasted or boiled and sometimes mixed with chili or smoke-dried herbs. The cornmeal was turned into cakes or buns, fried golden on the outside and steaming inside. These sliders were eaten cold during treks, packed in wrapped leaves or thin cloth. The sugars gave energy. The corn kept the body going. They looked simple, but they were carefully balanced survival meals. Now, cactus fruit is made into candy or cocktail syrup. The cornmeal sliders, replaced by frozen buns and fast food slogans. These sandwiches were not designed for flavor alone. They were made for movement, for endurance, for life in the dry and open spaces. And when we stopped walking the same roads, we stopped making the same food. What else have we let dry up? Buffalo heart sandwiches on stone bread were once reserved for warriors and hunters. Thin slices of buffalo heart grilled directly over open flame, then served on thick, chewy rounds of unleavened bread cooked on hot stones. This wasn't just food, it was fuel. Dense with iron and flavor, the heart meat had a gamey bite softened only slightly by the bread's smoky crust. It was eaten with bare hands, no utensils, no ceremony, just fire and hunger. Some added wild herbs, others nothing at all. It was a meal designed to travel, to sustain through hard rides or long scouts across open plains. The bread, dense and flat, could last for days. The heart, once cooked, was chewy but nourishing. In colder months, the sandwich would be wrapped in hide and tucked into a satchel, staying warm for hours against the body. Today, buffalo heart is more likely to be seen as an oddity at a specialty butcher, the tradition forgotten or sanitized into restaurant novelty. But once, this sandwich told a story of strength, sacrifice, and survival, etched into every bite by hands hardened from the land. Turkey and cranberry pemmican sandwiches were the original trail mix meets Thanksgiving dinner. Dried shreds of wild turkey were pounded with rendered fat and tart cranberries, then pressed into dense cakes or layered inside split cornbread pouches. This was not a meal made for pleasure, it was made for endurance. But somehow, the sweet-savory combination felt familiar, even warm. Carried during northeastern winters, this portable power food was eaten during hunts, travels, or times when game was scarce and the snow ran deep. Sometimes additional nuts or seeds were mixed in, and when cornbread was on hand, it became a sandwich, dense, chewy, and surprisingly rich. It didn't need refrigeration, it didn't spoil quickly, and it held the memory of autumn feasts long after the season had passed. Today, pemmican is known mostly among survivalists and historians, but this specific turkey and cranberry version was once common in the colder woodland regions. It's strange to think a meal this ancient tastes so much like the holidays, but maybe that's the point. It held on to warmth when everything else had frozen. Ash cakes stuffed with smoked rabbit were the kind of food you didn't find in markets. You had to earn them. Made by burying cornmeal dough directly into hot ashes beneath a fire, The outer layer blackened and crisped while the inside steamed to tender perfection. Once cooled, the cakes were split open and stuffed with shredded smoked rabbit, seasoned lightly with wild herbs or nothing at all. This was real survival fare, prepared deep in the woods or beside a smoldering hearth. The smoky flavors from both cake and meat melted together, making the whole thing taste like it had lived beside the fire for days. You could eat it hot, or wrap it in cloth and take it out again days later. There were no condiments, no napkins, no fancy names, just hunger and ingenuity. Some tribes even used clay to shield the dough from burning, peeling it off once baked. Today, ash cakes survive mostly as a footnote in cookbooks, and smoked rabbit is a rarity outside of specialty game markets. But once, these sandwiches were warm, smoky lifelines through long, lean winters. Walnut paste and apple bark sandwiches sound like a woodland riddle, but they were once a clever traveler's snack. Walnut meats were ground into a thick, oily paste, protein-rich, slightly bitter, and deeply satisfying. That paste was spread onto thin sheets of dried apple slices, sometimes softened slightly by heat, other times left crisp and bark-like. The result was a kind of nut butter and fruit sandwich that could be folded up, packed away, and eaten on the go without spoiling. The flavor was earthy and sweet, with a dry crunch that left your mouth thirsty but your belly full. Some versions even included hickory nuts or a drizzle of wild honey when available, though those were luxuries. It didn't need to be pretty. It just needed to work. Today, apple bark is nearly unheard of, and walnut paste has been overtaken by peanut butter and branding. But this was the original trail ration, prepared without a kitchen, without a label, just hands, heat, and memory. Blue corn and mesquite sandwich cakes carried the breath of the Southwest in every bite. The blue cornmeal, nutty and rich, was mixed with ground mesquite pods to form small cake-like breads that smelled faintly of sweet smoke and desert wind. These cakes were sliced and stuffed with roasted squash or mashed beans, hearty, warm, and subtly sweet. Made for fieldwork, hunting, or ceremonial journeys, they were often wrapped in cloth or corn husks and eaten days later. No preservatives, no frills, just flour, fire, and food. Today, blue corn still survives in niche markets and fry bread festivals, but the mesquite flavor, so once integral to the Southwestern palate, is fading fast. These little sandwich cakes were a survival food disguised as something sacred. Opossum tail sandwiches with spice ash rub might raise eyebrows today, but in Southeastern traditions, they were once a beloved delicacy. The tails, slow cooked until the meat slipped off the bone, were seasoned with a rub made from charred herbs and spices. Yes, actual culinary ash. This gave the meat a smoky, aromatic flavor, unlike anything you'd find in modern barbecue. The ash rub wasn't just for flavor. It also helped preserve the meat slightly and added essential minerals to the diet. Back then, nothing was wasted. Opossum wasn't a last resort. It was a choice. Today, it's relegated to urban legends and offbeat cooking shows, but once it was part of regular tables and seasonal feasts. And in that context, it wasn't weird. It was just dinner. Juniper smoked trout with corn husk wraps was a mountain meal you could smell before you could see. The trout, cleaned and lightly brined, was smoked over green juniper wood until its skin crinkled and the flesh turned a warm, golden hue. Then it was laid inside softened corn husks, sometimes with a few foraged greens or slivers of root vegetables. The husks were tied like little packages and either steamed or left as is, depending on the region. Eaten hot, they melted in your mouth. Eaten cold, they still tasted like the fire. The juniper gave it an aromatic, almost piney undertone, and the whole thing could be carried without refrigeration for days. This wasn't a sandwich in the modern sense, but it had all the makings of one: protein, starch, portability, and tradition. But this humble parcel once fed travelers, traders, and shepherds on high cliffs and quiet lakes. Hazelnut and wild onion spread sandwiches were the definition of less is more. Made by grinding roasted hazelnuts into a creamy paste and folding in finely chopped wild onions, The mixture was then spread onto thin, grainy flatbreads. Sometimes the flatbread was made from acorn or chestnut flour. Other times it was just coarse ground maize. The result was earthy, pungent, and filling. This was a forager's lunch, light to carry, dense with nutrients, and quick to prepare. You could eat it cold or warm it slightly over stones. Some versions were spiced with foraged herbs or ramp bulbs. Today, hazelnut paste is something you find in chocolates and spreads, but in the old days, it was protein fuel from the forest floor. The onions? Pulled straight from the soil, not shipped in from a warehouse. Bear-fat biscuit sandwiches with currants were not made for dainty appetites. The biscuits, dense and crumbly, were enriched with rendered bear fat instead of lard or butter. This gave them a rich, almost savory depth, and when split and filled with stewed wild currants or berry jam, they became something close to dessert, though they were always eaten as real sustenance. Bear fat was prized not just for its high energy, but also for its medicinal and preservative properties. Currants provided vitamin C and a tart brightness that cut through the heavy fat. These sandwiches were eaten in colder climates, often during hunting expeditions or seasonal migrations. They traveled well and tasted even better after a day's work. Today, bear fat is nearly extinct from the pantry, seen more as a novelty than a necessity. But these sandwiches once carried people through winters and wilderness both. Roasted grasshopper cakes with choke cherry glaze were the original protein bars. Grasshoppers were toasted until crisp and nutty, then folded into a simple grain batter and cooked like pancakes or cakes. Once cooled, they were glazed with boiled-down choke cherry syrup, dark, tart, and sticky. You could eat them hot off the griddle or carry them for days. They were light but filling, with a crunch that surprised anyone unfamiliar. Grasshoppers weren't seen as strange. They were a respected source of clean, abundant protein. The choke cherry, with its deep red hue and sharp bite, added color and complexity. This was not a joke food. It was real fuel, prepared with care. Today, we shy away from insects on the plate, calling them pests instead of provisions. But once, these little cakes were survival in a pocket, nourishment in a bite, and proof that the land always provided. You just had to listen. Prairie chicken was once so common on the plains that people barely looked twice when it landed on their plate. These days, you'd be lucky to spot one outside a conservation area. But back then, its lean, almost pheasant-like meat was a staple for hunters and homesteaders. Sandwiches were built around it, typically layered inside a dense cornbread pocket with spicy mustard leaves gathered from nearby fields. The cornbread wasn't the sweet version we know today either. It was rough, baked in cast iron or even directly over coals. The mustard leaves added bite and helped cut through the meat's earthiness. Sometimes wild onions or a dab of rendered fat made their way into the mix. It was a sandwich built from necessity but remembered with pride, a true frontier meal that's all but vanished in modern kitchens, except maybe in memory. Wild plum and smoked turkey in early native pitas. It sounds like something out of a high-end cookbook, but it was a winter staple for many northeastern tribes. The turkey, smoked over slow embers with bark and pine, kept for weeks. The wild plums, boiled down into a thick, tart chutney, added both preservation and punch. The pita wasn't quite what we imagine today. It was a thin cornbread round, flexible enough to fold but sturdy enough to hold meat and fruit. Each bite was smoky, tangy, and just sweet enough to feel nourishing. In the lean winter months, this sandwich wasn't just practical, it was brilliant. High in protein, balanced in flavor, and compact for travel. Hunters carried them, mothers packed them, and elders handed down the recipe orally. Now it's barely remembered outside food anthropology circles, but it deserves a place among history's great handheld meals. Somehow, ancient practicality always had a way of tasting good. Juniper berry roasted squirrel isn't a punchline. It was survival food that somehow managed to taste like it belonged at a campfire banquet. When meat was scarce, squirrels were plentiful, especially in wooded regions where they practically fell into the stew pot. Roasting them with crushed juniper berries gave the gamey meat a bright, piney lift. Once tender, the meat was shredded and packed into flatbread, usually made from whatever grain or seed flour was on hand: acorn, corn, or even cattail. The sandwich was small but rich, chewy but satisfying. Hunters ate it on the trail, families shared them during autumn gatherings, and kids likely learned early not to waste even the tail. Juniper helped with digestion too, making it medicinal as much as flavorful. Today, most folks would turn up their noses at squirrel meat, but back then, it was simply another part of the land's offering. One bite of that peppery, slightly wild sandwich, and you'd understand. It was rough country cuisine with a surprising touch of finesse. Fire-roasted corn and lard biscuits filled with salt pork were built for cold mornings and colder travel. These dense, flat biscuits were nothing like the fluffy ones we know today. They were grilled directly on a hot stone or cast iron plate, usually laced with rendered lard to make them heavy, crumbly, and high-calorie. The filling was salt pork, thick, briny, and greasy in the best possible way. When cooked low and slow, the pork turned tender and spreadable. You'd slice the biscuit open, slap in a hunk of pork, maybe add a smear of bean mash or wild herbs, and you had a sandwich built to fuel hours of labor. Nomadic hunters packed them along migration paths. Trappers kept them in their satchels near the river. Salt preserved the pork, and fat preserved energy. The biscuit acted like an edible canteen, keeping everything safe and dry inside. This sandwich was pure necessity, but also pure grit. It tasted like smoke, salt, and survival. Mussels and wild garlic on water lily cakes might be the most elegant riverbank meal you've never heard of. These freshwater sandwiches were built by hand, slowly. First, the mussels were gathered and steamed in fire-pitted clay pots until their briny shells popped open. Then came the wild garlic, sharp, pungent, and ground into a sort of paste. All of this was layered onto cakes made from dried groundwater lily root, which had a sticky, chewy texture once steamed. The cakes were small, almost palm-sized, and carried just enough sweetness to contrast the garlicky shellfish. You'd fold one over like a taco and eat it fast before it cooled. It was a favorite among river-dwelling tribes, especially during summer foraging season. Despite its simplicity, it offered rich protein, cleansing greens, and even a medicinal edge. These sandwiches never traveled far. They were meant to be eaten feet from where they were gathered. That's probably why they vanished so quietly. Maple-sweetened acorn butter sandwiches with dried apple slices were the original trail snacks, sweet, dense, and packed with energy. Acorns, when properly leached and ground, created a thick, nutty paste full of calories and nutrients. Stir in some early-season maple syrup, and suddenly it tasted like dessert. For bread, people used dehydrated apple slices or flattened nut cakes, anything stiff enough to sandwich the acorn mash. The result was chewy, slightly crumbly, and naturally sweet without being cloying. It was the kind of meal you packed for a long walk through the woods or to keep kids happy on chilly afternoons. Because everything was dried, it kept well in a pouch or bag. No mold, no spoilage, just slow energy for long days. These were especially popular in fall and winter when apples were drying by the fire and sap was being collected. Nowadays, we call it snack innovation. Back then, it was just common sense. Delicious, portable, and humble. It was survival with a smile. Fried gizzards on corn cakes with hot pepper relish might sound like something from an old southern fairground, but this sandwich had roots deep in native kitchens. Gizzards, the muscular part of a bird's stomach, were cleaned, simmered until tender, then fried crisp with fat and ash-seasoned flour. Plopped onto a thick corn cake, gritty, smoky, and fresh off a fire, they became the star of a meal that was equal parts chewy and crunchy. The pepper relish? Fermented wild chilies, onions, and sometimes even fermented berries added a bright, spicy contrast. This wasn't food for the faint of heart. It had texture, heat, and history. You'd often find it at powwows or community cookouts where nothing went to waste. But it also showed up in lunch pouches for long hunts or days spent at river camps. Today, gizzards are usually discarded, and wild pepper relishes replaced by bottled versions. But this sandwich was more than rustic. It was resourceful, bold, and unforgettable once you tasted it. Sturgeon jerky on split plantain wraps may sound tropical, but this sandwich hails from the icy edges of the Great Lakes. Sturgeon was once so common in those waters, people smoked it like firewood. After long, slow smoking, the meat turned dark, dense, and slightly sweet. A true jerky. The wrap came from plantain-style leaves, broad, slightly bitter greenery steamed soft and folded like a taco. Inside, the jerky was sometimes mixed with marrow or fat to rehydrate it slightly, giving each bite a chewy, satisfying depth. Hunters and fishers carried these in bark pouches, unwrapping one for a fast burst of energy. It was practical, no plates, no prep, just pure fuel. The bitterness of the wrap and the richness of the sturgeon balanced beautifully. Once a common sight on trading routes, this sandwich has nearly disappeared except in oral stories and some rare ceremonial meals. It was survival disguised as tradition, and once upon a time, it fed nations. Pumpkin seed butter sandwiches with roasted maize were the ultimate kids' snack on the Great Plains. Pumpkin seeds, cleaned, dried, and stone ground into a rich green paste, were the peanut butter of their day. Roasted maize kernels, sometimes pounded or kept whole, added a crunchy contrast that popped with every bite. The bread was usually a small, flattened maize cake, baked over fire and pliable enough to hold a smear of seed butter. This was the kind of treat a grandmother made from whatever was left after harvest. It was protein-rich, full of good fats, and easy to tuck into a pocket or basket. Sometimes a bit of honey or berry syrup was drizzled on top if available. Children loved it, but adults did too. It kept energy up without spoiling, making it a favorite for long journeys or field work. Today, pumpkin seed butter has made a comeback in health food aisles, but few remember its roots. On the prairie, it was more than a snack. It was tradition. Sweetgrass smoked goose on wild grain rolls sounds like something you'd order in a restaurant today, but it began as ceremonial food. Sweetgrass, a sacred plant, was dried and used to line smoking pits. When goose breasts were laid over the smoke, they took on a fragrance that was both sweet and earthy. The meat was then sliced thin and placed in rolls made from mixed wild grains, amaranth, goosefoot, and maize, all stone ground and steamed into soft loaves. This wasn't everyday food. It was reserved for special events, naming ceremonies, seasonal festivals, or treaty gatherings. The flavor was subtle, layered, and deeply rooted in cultural memory. Eating it was more than nourishment. It was communion. Each bite connected the eater to the land, the water, and the ancestors who passed down the recipe. Today, very few know how to smoke with sweetgrass or bake with those grain blends, but in certain circles, the tradition lives quietly on, passed from hand to hand, one loaf at a time. If any of these long-lost sandwiches made you hungry, leave us a comment, tap that like button like it's a biscuit on a griddle, and subscribe.